My name is Lena Matson, and I am one of the reference librarians in the Geography and Map Division. I'm honored to kick off the second half of our program today by introducing our next speakers. Juliet Wiersma specializes in the visual and material culture of the pre-Hispanic and late Spanish colonial Andes. She holds a PhD in art history and archaeology from the University of Maryland and an MA from the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU. Juliet's new book project, Ports of Plunder and Islands of Entanglement, William Hack's Pirate Maps of the Spanish South Sea, critically examines extant copies of Hack's hand-painted South Sea wagoners, focusing attention on the geographic areas between the two gateways of entry into the Pacific, the Isthmus of Panama and the Straits of Magellan. Her study aims to recover the overlooked but pivotal role that unfrequented bays, lesser ports, and remote islands held for Spanish navigators and their foreign adversaries. Megan Hill is a preservation science specialist in the Preservation Research and Testing Division here at the Library of Congress. Her background is in fine art, art history, and curatorial studies, having graduated with a BFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art, and she is currently a PhD candidate at the University College Cork, exemplifying the impact of scientific research on humanities-based scholarship. She is an expert in spectral imaging and has worked with numerous cultural heritage institutions around the world to integrate and establish multispectral workflows in their digitization and preservation programs. At the library, she works with conservators, curators, and scholars to apply non-invasive optical technologies to support the preservation of the library's extensive and eclectic collections and expand the historical understanding of these materials. What brings our two distinguished speakers together today is a rare manuscript atlas of the East Indies made by William Hack in 1690 and held in the library's Geography and Map Division since 1900, recommended for purchase by Philip Lee Phillips himself. Through our speakers' combined expertise, you will hear about this atlas's focus on the global spice trade and about what technical analysis of the atlas's paper, ink, and pigments can tell us about Hack's materials and construction methods. This interdisciplinary research initiative exemplifies how the collaboration of science and scholarship can shape and alter our interpretations of objects in the Library of Congress's collections, as well as expand our understanding and appreciation of cultural heritage. Without further ado, please help me welcome Juliet Wiersma and Megan Hill to the stage for Sights on Spice.
So beat that. Thank you very much for that introduction, very thorough introduction. It's nice to have Megan up here on stage, and we look forward to exploring this very fascinating atlas with you today. Okay, so we just had this wonderful break, and at the break there were lots of tidbits, and there was some coffee and tea. Who took advantage of a little coffee, a little tea? A couple of you, all right. This morning, earlier today, how many of us had coffee or tea this morning when we got up? And maybe if you went to Starbucks, you sprinkled a little cinnamon or maybe a little nutmeg on your latte. All right. Okay, so if you raised your hand, you have 17th century English navigators and merchants to thank, as well as native people in Sumatra, Yemen, Java, and China who cultivated these crops and readied them for global export. The spice trade, the maritime counterpart to the Silk Road, is very much at the center of the manuscript atlas that we're going to be exploring today. So I just wanted to point out that as geographically and temporally distant as the early spice trade may seem to us today, it has played a huge role in shaping our everyday lives and daily routines, right? Okay, so this large presentation style atlas, which you see here, is entitled Description of the Seacoast of the East Indies and was made by English cartographer William Hack at the end of the 17th century. And it was actually on view. Did many of you get a chance to take a look at it? Yeah, I mean, it's like very large format, very spectacular drawings. So I'm going to make a quick plug for two excellent blogs by specialists in the Geography and Map Division that relate to this atlas. So after this talk, you can learn even more about spice trade and about William Hack. So Cynthia Smith's essay on William Hack, a pirate's cartographer, and another is Abraham Parish's post on the 18th century East India trade. Hack's East Indies Atlas is comprised of 94 maritime charts that take us from the Cape of Good Hope in today's South Africa towards Japan. And to get a better sense of this extensive route that these maps cover, we can look to John Thornton's slightly later A New Map of the World. And I'm going to just click here, and you will see roughly sketched the start point and the end point, and then all of the points in between are the maps that are included in the atlas that some of you had a chance to look at the break. So for the past few years, I've been working on another manuscript atlas by this same hydrographer, William Hack, but those depicting the South Sea or the Pacific Ocean. So when Dr. Paulette Hazier invited me to discuss the East Indies Atlas with you, I was really excited to have a chance to look at some more of Hack's cartographic output, but at the same time, I was a bit terrified because I am a Latin American art historian who focuses on North and South American continents, and I am much less familiar with the geography and history of the Western and Central Indo-Pacific. But we will find some interesting things in here for everyone. So Hack's East Indies Atlas was created around 1690, meaning it predates the U.S. Constitution by nearly a century. Since its creation, Hack's Atlas has outlived 17th century monarchs. It has outlived 18th, 19th, 20th century monarchs as well, which reminds us that even ephemeral works on paper outlast kings, governments, movements, ideas, and ideologies, not to mention political boundaries and territorial sovereignties. The places represented in Hack's Atlas have had pluralistic existences, occupied by diverse people, races, and religions over the course of millennia. Through Hack's Atlas, we have an opportunity and indeed an invitation to revisit and rethink the past. So the research that Megan Hill and I have been working on or undertaking on this atlas is very much in its incipient stages. Well, hers is a little more definitive. Mine's a little more incipient. But it's also very visually and materially focused. And so what we'd like to show today is how a careful, critical examination of the visual alongside the material enables us to better formulate questions about the historical. So we might start by asking how a 17th century atlas from London made its way from London to Washington, D.C. Hack's Atlas of the East Indies was listed for sale in the 1899 catalog of Martinez Nayhoff. I think, is that right, Chet? Yes, okay. A publisher and bookseller who operated out of New York and The Hague. And as has already been mentioned, Hack's Atlas was recommended for purchase in 1900 by Philip Lee Phillips, the first superintendent of the Hall of Maps and Charts at the Library of Congress, and the man that we are honoring here today. The library's order division files regarding this acquisition remind us that, like the tea, coffee, and pepper that Hack's Atlas alludes to, his book of charts also traveled a great distance by sea to get here, so sailing from Rotterdam to New York via the Holland America line, and then, ultimately, I guess, by train to D.C. Hack's Atlas of the East Indies, held in the Library of Congress's Geography and Map Division, is one of 3 East Indies atlases made by Hack. The other 2 are held at the British Library. All 3 are believed to have been created around the same time, between 1690 and 1700, but none of the 3 is an exact copy of the other. These 2, based on title, number of maps, the title pages, as you can see, seem to share the most commonalities. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Hack, and I will state that not a lot is known about William Hack. According to historian James Kelly, Hack was the son of a Winchester innkeeper and began his chart making apprenticeship in 1671 under Andrew Welch, who was a cartographer of the Thames School or Drapers Company. And so Hack's last known map is dated 1702. That's sort of the end date then for that window. And during this 30-year period of productivity, Hack made hundreds of charts as a member of the so-named Thames School. Historian Alistair Mayer, one of the foremost authorities on the Thames School, has characterized its members as a collection of copyists and cartographers who transferred and updated information on maritime charts. Thames School chart makers produced mainly manuscript maps as opposed to printed ones. And Mayer notes that the importance of the Thames School is inherently connected to the emergence of England as a maritime power during the 17th century. The charts of the Thames School reflect the breadth of English overseas interests. And now I will have my drink. I'm just kidding. It's going to have a sip of water. The Thames School is defined by location. So basically, these guys had their ateliers along the River Thames, as well as by style. Okay, we'll leave this here for now. The style borrowed from Portland charts. It included bold-colored outlines, clear and well-formed lettering, ornate floral cartouches, colorful compass roses, and sometimes bright borders. While charts of the Thames School were highly professional, they were also highly decorative. Traits of the Thames School style come into high relief when we compare charts from two or more of its various practitioners. I think there are some 41, for example. So we can look here at Nicholas Cumberford's chart of the Indian Ocean from the 1660s and compare that with one made by John Thornton, also of the same ocean, from 1682. And I know this is kind of far away for many of you, but if you are comparing these two, one subtle difference is that we have the addition, highlighted it here, of Thornton's signature, where he provides also a date, and he identifies himself with the Thames School by putting on his chart at the sign of the plot, which was kind of their signature. So Hack is not the first Thames School chart maker to draw maps of the East Indies, but he does seem to be one of the most prolific, with some 300 plus renderings to his name. And while Hack's style breaks from his contemporaries, a comparison of his charts with other Thames School chart makers reveals that Hack is also looking to and borrowing from earlier charts. So just to give you a sense of this, we're going to compare this chart by William Hack that's in the atlas, in that East Indies atlas, with one by the Thames School chart maker who trained him, Andrew Welch. And so this is a map depicting a place in India called Gujarat, one of the wealthiest and most prosperous provinces in the Mughal Empire, with a major hub of commerce between India, which was a major hub of commerce between India, the Middle East, and Africa. But it was also a supplier of indigo, cotton, and silk. And so both of these charts, can you see that? Paulette, can you kind of see that wave in the back? More or less. Okay. Both of these charts are featuring an aerial view of India's coasts. We can discern differences in color palette, textual orientation, and also the size of the compass rose. But Hack seems to be working from Welch's chart, including this detail of the English ship appearing off the coast. And as Chet's work has pointed out, earlier work, Hack acknowledges that he is borrowing from an English original. There's a little tiny EO in the corner at the bottom. And so throughout this atlas, you've got Dutch original, English original. Is there a Spanish original, Chet? French? Okay. Which is interesting as well. So he's acknowledging that he's borrowing. He's not telling us who he's borrowing from, but based on this comparison with Andrew Welch, it seems possible that he is looking to Andrew Welch's chart. We get a further sense of Hack's adherence to and divergence from the Thames School chart by looking to two maps of Mocha in today's Yemen. One of these is by a Thames School contemporary, Augustine Fitzhugh, and then the other is by Hack. So Hack's map is going to be on the right-hand side of the screen. Mocha, just a historical note, was an important port for trade in coffee, dyewoods, and ivory, and it had been developed as a port city by the Ottomans in 1538. At first glance, these two works seem distinct, but upon closer inspection, we see that Hack appears to be borrowing visual and textual information from Fitzhugh, as he did with Welch. So at the top of both charts, you see there are two coastal profiles. And then below, you see that both have a scale, a compass rose. I don't think this pointer is working on the screen. Oh, it is? Okay, I can't see it from here, so I'll just be leading you around blindly. But compass rose, both include that. They both also include the scale. And then the legend appears on the left-hand side of each, and then a description appears on the right side of each. So, lots of similarities between these two. If we zoom in, we see that the elevations are morphologically similar, but stylistically distinct. Hack follows Fitzhugh in providing two different elevations. The upper is reflecting what Mocha's coastline looked like on clear days, and the lower profile is showing what a navigator would see on hazy days. Hack's color palette is more subdued than Fitzhugh's, maybe even a little more limited, but his text is a lot more prominent. And in Hack's description, he emphasizes that Mocha is the principal town of trade in all of Arabia Felix, today's Yemen. Okay, so as Alistair Mayer has pointed out, the Thames School is inherently connected to England's emergence as a maritime power during the 17th century. The charts of the Thames School make visible England's interrelated interests, mapping, and trade, and reflect the breadth of English overseas ambitions. So by the late 17th century, the Thames School charts exhibit overt signs of England's imperial aspirations. And we will see signs of this in the atlas that we had on view just a little while ago. This idea of, chart makers showing overt signs of English aspirations is also very apparent in Hack's charts of the Pacific Ocean. So here's an example of one of these. It's kind of the overall overview map, but it's also serving as a title page where all of the places listed from Central America down to the tip of South America, each has its own individual map. But what Hack is highlighting on this title page is Darien, and namely King Golden Cap of the Darien, because there's lots of gold in that region. And he's also highlighting through this very large emblem Potosi, which is, where all of this silver is coming from that's really fueling global commerce at this point. So on this, so here he is again singling out Darien and Potosi through these large emblems, announcing the mineral wealth of areas that England hoped to exploit illicitly if need be. Hack's charts of the East Indies also highlight England's commercial interests and imperial aspirations, but they differ because the coveted goods from India and Southeast Asia were obtained by the English largely through licit trade. So just to give you a little bit of background on the English East India Company. So it comes into existence around precisely 1600 under Elizabeth I. Her letter to the King of Aceh in Western Sumatra. Again, just that whole concept that she sends a letter to Sumatra in 1600 is kind of mind-blowing. And it gets there, and he responds. But this letter it represents England's first attempt to gain a foothold in the lucrative spice trade. A year later, the East India Company made its first voyage to Sumatra and Java. England was one of many European powers engaged in this far-reaching trade, which brought Bengal silk cotton textiles, spices, coffee, saltpeter, and other exotic and valued commodities to European ports. Other European countries involved in Indian and Southeast Asian trade included Portugal, the Netherlands, France, Denmark, and Sweden. The English East India Company utilized a factory system that relied upon leaving agents, commonly known as factors, in the Indo-Pacific to procure spices and other commodities for future voyages, thereby decreasing companies' overhead. These factors established themselves in settlements that ranged from modest factories or warehouses in ports, where they enjoyed the protection of local rulers. But then these factories could also be a lot bigger, and they would include self-contained fortified enclaves, complete with naval arsenals. And some of these factors resided in these places for decades, wrote accounts, about their families, their lives, sort of daily routines, and in places that were very obviously foreign to their English compatriots. So as the 17th century progressed, the English East India Company expanded its monopolies, and they became, by 1670, the primary rival of the Dutch East India Company for European trade in Asia. The English East India Company held notable economic power, but in 1683, they were given full power by the crown to declare war or make peace with any state in Asia, Africa, or America. And so all of this context, is just to sort of remind us that this is precisely the time that Hack is creating this atlas, this time of increasing English imperialism in the Indo-Pacific. Okay, so with that bit of context, we're going to return back to the main event here, which is Hack's atlas. So I'm going to just note that this atlas presents some challenges. For modern viewers, it certainly presented some challenges for me. The first challenge is that we don't get an orienting map. Hack doesn't tell us where we're starting or where we're ending. So the atlas begins with the table of contents, and it moves directly to the map of Monomotapa. If you were like me, I had no idea where that was. It refers to an African kingdom in today's Zimbabwe, where we find Cape Buena Esperanza, or the Cape of Good Hope, which opened a sea route to India and the East. So between this first map of Monomotapa and the final map, cartographic renderings take us along the eastern coast of Africa, the Red Sea, the coast of today's Yemen, Iraq, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Myanmar or Burma, Malaysia, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, the Philippines, Taiwan, China, and Japan. So one challenge, no orienting map. You got to kind of figure things out on your own if you're a 21st century viewer. Another challenge of this atlas is that the 17th century toponyms differ dramatically from the place names that we are familiar with today. So some of these places are close, like Calicut, today's Calcutta. Some are familiar, Bombay, today's Mumbai. But others require a bit of decoding. And so to get a better sense of where these places were located in geographical space, I looked to a later map created by Herman Moll, a new and correct map of the world from 1719, which is also in the Library of Congress's collection. And so in this detail, I'm just going to zoom in here. We get a sense of some of the places. It's a little hard to see from where you are probably, but Gujarat is here, Bombay is here, and then Calicut is also shown on this western coast of India. So, this is a good orienting map to sort of decode some of the 17th century place names. And then, we can more easily correlate them with our Google Maps or whatever we're looking at hand. So approaching Hack's atlas from a purely visual perspective, a few things stand out. One of them is the number of maps depicting Sumatra and Java. The table of contents indicates that there are 9 maps of Sumatra and 8 of Java, underscoring these places as of key importance to England's East India Company. Sumatra and Java offered commodities that were highly sought by European and global markets. Uh, Herman Mall describes Sumatra as one of the greatest islands in the world, noting its mines of gold, silver, copper, and tin, and its copious amounts of sugar, ginger, and pepper that fill many trade vessels each year. Again, toward the bottom, he talks about the crocodiles and all kinds of intimidating creatures that are there as well. Java, meanwhile, produced rice, salt, and pepper. Sumatra and Java were also of strategic importance, geographically positioned near the Straits of Malacca, which was a major shipping route between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and the Strait of Sunda, which connects the Java Sea to the Indian Ocean. So another thing that kind of stands out when you're just doing a visual first pass through HAC's Atlas are the many flags that appear throughout. Flags, as you see here, surround the cartouche of the title page, but they're not purely decorative. They are referencing the countries that hold factories and forts in India and Southeast Asia. And so here I'm just going to highlight the word factories in the middle, which is the only term really that appears on this title page, that isn't a name of a geographical place. So he's pointing out that he is indicating where these various European factories are in his atlas. So through these flags, HAC identifies the various nations who engage in East Indies trade. And to get a sense of which countries these 17th century and thus historical flags represented, I needed a little bit of help. And so I found a German vexillologist or flag expert named Klaus Michael Schneider, who helped me decipher a couple of these. So if we move to the title page again, starting at the top, we have the flags of Great Britain, so the Union Jack. We also have the white, or the St. George's Cross representing England. We have Sweden. Oops, okay. Next one down. Sweden and the Netherlands. Spain, not exactly Spain's flag, but close. And Denmark. The white flag is a little bit of a mystery, but we're going to circle back to that. And then at bottom right, we have the saffron swallowtail pennant of the Maratha Empire, which is significant as it is the only non-European flag that's represented on this title page. So notably absent is the flag of Portugal, whose native son Vasco da Gama opened the sea route to India at the end of the 15th century. By the time that HAC had created his atlas, Portugal had lost many of its Indian possessions, but still did hold a handful on India's northwestern coast. In the same atlas, France has also apparently been written out of the East Indies trade by HAC. We don't have any French flags on here, despite the fact that Louis XIV's East India Company had been founded some 25 years earlier in August of 1664. So, we've got these inclusions, these omissions. They're clearly intentional, but what is HAC trying to communicate with these? Flags appear in the interior maps as well, especially along the west and east coast of India, where flags mark the sites of European factories. So in this map of Mocha, alongside minarets, which you see kind of in the center, a flag marks a Dutch factory. And to the left of this flag, we see a fortification, which kind of alludes to sometimes it was just a little warehouse and sometimes it was more of an enclave. This depiction, which suggests that the Dutch and the Dutch alone are capitalizing on Mocha's trade, is again somewhat misleading. An English factory had been established at Mocha by the East India Company a decade earlier in 1682, 8 years before this atlas was created. So again, this is an omission, intentional on HAC's part. What is he trying to communicate with this? Meanwhile, at Bombay, a Union Jack proclaims it as an English colony. The English acquired Bombay in 1661 as part of the dowry for Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese bride of Charles II. Bombay is the only English site where we see a Union Jack on this map. Usually to indicate English presence. We have the St. George's Cross, as you see here on the map of Rojapur. Flags tend to pile up at major hubs like Surat, which was an Indian seaport that became a vital English trading base. And so here I'll kind of zoom this out a little bit. We have 2 Dutch flags, 2 St. George's Cross or English flags, and a Danish flag. Now, again, just going to these omissions, the French had established their factory at Surat in 1668, and yet the French flag is absent from Hack's map. Hack does include a little white map. You can kind of see at the bottom there. So the question is this a white flag standing in for French presence in at least at the site of Surat? I don't know how to answer that yet. In this detail of India's Coromandel coast, we see 1 English, 1 Danish, and 4 Dutch flags, as well as 2 saffron flags of the Maratha Empire. And at left bottom, we see 2 Dutch flags on the island we know today as Sri Lanka. And there is also a white flag, which I will highlight here, at the Fort of St. Thomas. And again, historically, the Fort of St. Thomas was constructed by the Portuguese in 1518. The town and fort ended up in Dutch control by 1661. In 1672, the French briefly captured Fort St. Thomas, but were driven out by the Dutch after a long and costly siege. So again, is Hack's use of the white flag in this case also referencing French holdings in the East Indies as it represents places that were maybe up for grabs? Not entirely clear. So the only Spanish flags that we get on Hack's atlas are seen in the Philippines at Manila, which I will draw your attention to here. And then we also have a mysterious flag, which is not included on the atlas's title page, but appears a handful of times throughout the atlas. Megan and I began to refer to this as the rainbow flag because on the Library of Congress atlas, it contains horizontal stripes of blue, red, yellow, and purple with a center black circle and cross. So this flag is going to appear, or does appear, on maps of Goa City, which was an important hub for the Eastern spice trade and a Portuguese colony from 1510 until 1961. It also appears at Bassam, which is today's Versailles, where the Portuguese had established their first factory in 1526. Here Hack has this as Bocine. It also appears on maps identifying a place called Anor, which may refer to Ananor, as well as what appears to be a ship or shoal. Looks more like a ship, but I think it's actually a shoal near Bombay. So what do we do with this mysterious flag? It seems to mark the site of a factory, but of which country? So to get to some of the answers to this, or some of the likely answers, we can turn to a very useful printed map produced around 1715 by Herman Moll for the directors of the East India Company. And is this the map that you talk about in your blog? Okay. So this is going to give us a lot of really great information. So here he highlights that what he is doing is he is marking the sites of settlements and factories belonging to England, Spain, France, Holland, Denmark, and Portugal. And so this is detail, obviously. Here's the entire map. You see at the far right the cartouche we were just looking at. And then on the left, you've got 5 cartouches that refer to factories, major factories at the time: Surat, Goa, St. George, Bantam, and Batavia. So all important, but worth noting that not all of these were English. So if we navigate to India's western Malabar coast, so I'm going to highlight that over there for you. I'm going to zoom in there. We see that sites like Bombay, Karmar, Tellicherry, and Calicut are labeled English. Meanwhile, Rojapur is noted as French, and Basilor and Cananor are identified as having Dutch factories. If we move to the opposite coast, to the Coromandel coast, we see a Danish fort at Tranquebar down at the very, very bottom in purple, and English and Dutch factories as we continue further up the coast. If we use Mall's map to identify the places that correspond with Hack's mysterious striped flag, so again, they're appearing on this stretch of coast, and they include the shoal near Bombay, Goa, and Ananor. We find on Mall's map the same notation on most of these, which is to Portugal, Portuguese factory, etc. So this seems to indicate that the rainbow flag that Hack is using and that Hack seems to have created, because I can't, even with this vexillologist, we couldn't find of the country that this flag seemed to pertain to, or a trading company. So this seems to be Hack's way of indicating Portuguese presence in India. If we turn now to return really to the title page of Hack's East Indies Atlas at the Library of Congress, and we compare it to the title page of the atlas held at the British Library, we see that the rainbow flag does appear on the British Library title page, but it does not appear on the Library of Congress title page. So Hack is changing the order of the country flags, but they're saying the same for the most part. The one switch out that he does is he trades out the rainbow flag for the Marathan Empire flag on the Library of Congress title page. And again, yeah, okay. So if we stay with the British Library Atlas, we're going to look to one other map on its interior that, thanks to Chet, I was able to get this image. We find the mystery flag on the map of Goa, where it appears differently. It's not a rainbow anymore. Now it's blue and white and red stripes. And Hack explicitly states that this is a place that is inhabited by the Portuguese. So this seems to confirm that this mysterious flag refers to Portuguese presence in the East Indies. Okay, and with that, I'm just going to kind of sum up my little portion here. So as I've aimed to demonstrate, a careful visual analysis can better direct and focus our historical inquiry. And so based on this visual analysis, some of the questions that I have include, why are the French and Portuguese silenced or sort of obliquely referenced in Hack's East Indies Atlas? And many of you who work on the East Indies might know the answer to that, so please tell me. What does the preponderance of maps of Sumatra and Java suggest about England's designs on these islands at this time? What does the inclusion of the Marathan flag on the Library of Congress Atlas and its omission on the British Library's Atlas suggest about England's relationship with this emerging Hindu confederation who controlled central western India around Goa? Is Hack responding to a political realignment with these, flags, the swapping out of flags? Or is he, catering to the interests of the patron or recipient of this atlas? A visual study also raises questions about the material. Okay, and I think here, oops, we already do this? Oh, I already got that. Oops, okay, now I'm gonna have to step down because I can't see. I don't have this on my hip. Okay, so in terms of raising questions about the material.
Okay, yeah, you're like,
Okay, I just can't see it. Okay. All right. Well, let's see. This is the problem.
But you're sweet and thank you if you like. Thank you.
Am I on? Okay. So this, a visual study also raises questions about the material. So these are exactly the questions that Megan will address in her portion of the talk. So watermarks paper, we were wondering about this. Do the watermarks conform to Hack's other Atlas projects, right? Are we seeing the same watermarks? How many different watermarks are discernible? What do these watermarks suggest about the production of the Atlas? And then in terms of pigments, we had questions about the pigments, which we can answer because we have a preservation research and testing division at the Library of Congress. So what are the pigments that were used for the reds, blues, and greens? Are these pigments consistent with the period, right? Late 17th century. Are pigments consistent throughout, or do they vary? Are there different reds, different blues? What pigments are used in the rainbow flag? Is there evidence of modern pigments suggesting modern restoration or invention? That's always a good question to ask. And then in terms of pentimenti or underdrawing, uh, is there evidence of preparatory drawings? And is there evidence of changes made to the maps in these atlases, in this atlas, I should say? And so for these questions, we now turn to our material science expert, Megan Hill. So I will turn the stage over to you.
Oops, wrong way. So now we move on to the technical analysis part. So as a little bit of a background, I'm from the Preservation Research and Testing Division, or also known as PRTD, which I'll continually refer to it as. So if you're not that familiar with what we do, just a little bit of a background, we are uniquely situated at the Library of Congress. We're very fortunate to have an entire division and, more importantly, entire staff dedicated specifically to preservation science research, with fully equipped labs to do so, as you can see in this slide here. So the bottom there is our optical properties laboratory, where we work with most of our collection items. We solve preservation challenges, especially non-invasively, conducting research for what the specific materials of our collection items need while minimizing the impact to them. And so we also work very closely with our special collection divisions to answer curatorial and research questions that can benefit from the type of technology that we have in our labs that I'm kind of going to go into, going to explain a little bit more. And it allows us to essentially investigate the life cycle of a collection item. So a lot of what we do, like I said, is non-invasive. We use imaging and spectroscopy techniques. So none of it is harmful to the materials of collection items. We don't do any physical sampling, and most of our instruments don't even need to make contact whatsoever with the collection item. So curators usually really love that. Essentially, what we're doing is we're using a wide range of sections of the electromagnetic spectrum, so from X-rays to the ultraviolet, visible, and infrared spectrums. So even though, some of those words send red flags to us because as humans, their X-rays aren't great for us, but they are not harmful to the collection items and the materials that we encounter. And essentially, we're shining different types of light on a material, and we're measuring what bounces back or what's absorbed by the material. And those kind of unique properties help us identify what the materials and what the collection item is made out of. And so for this research project, we primarily use multispectral imaging, or MSI, X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, XRF, which tells us the elemental composition of materials, and also fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, which tells us more about kind of color information or kind of non-visible information, like what binders a pigment may have been made from, or if there's any sort of coatings on a paper, questions like that. And so we always start usually with multispectral imaging, which is a digital photography technique, again, non-invasive, that spans outside of just white light or the visible spectrum. And so we incorporate ultraviolet, visible, and infrared. Even though we can't see in those spectrums, the camera can and picks up a lot of really useful information that we can explore. And what that looks like essentially is when we go through these different wave bands, you can see on the right-hand side there how the materials start to look differently. Sometimes they appear brighter because they're reflecting the light. Sometimes they look darker because they're absorbing the light. And it's those differences that we use with certain computer programs that help us answer different research questions. And so we started with looking at the watermarks, as Julia implied. We found that there were two watermarks, specifically these two, an HP and a DS. And then as we were going through the different maps in the atlas itself, we were realizing that there were visual trends with these two watermarks on the different pages. And so the one on the right, we could tell that it's definitely a heavier paper, and it often had more foxing going on with it. So it was in kind of a different state of degradation than the other paper. And so that led us kind of to question what other trends could we see between the two types of paper. Was Hack being consistent in using in the different papers, or was maybe someone else doing illustrations on one paper, he was using another, things like that. And so one thing we noticed, interestingly enough, is that on one watermark paper, the flags seemed to have very straight edges, and on the other paper, the flags seemed to have scalloped edges. We haven't gone through every single page, but we went through enough to see that this was actually a trend. Not exactly sure what it means yet, but it was something that, that we noticed and picked up on. Oops. And I should say too is this led us to wonder whether or not the pigment palettes were the same on both papers or not. So first, we decided to take a look at the ink that was used across the map, and it is in fact iron gall ink, very common for the time period, used for hundreds of years, and we could tell that very quickly and very easily because a characteristic of iron gall ink is that it drops out and looks invisible in infrared light. And then also when we do a special kind of processing, specifically called false color infrared, iron gall ink will turn red in the processed image compared to other printed inks, carbon-based inks, which just still stay black. And I'll digress a little bit, but while I have this image up, I do want to note that one of the questions about the white flag in particular was it used as like a cover-up? Was it originally a flag and then painted over or something like that? And so when we use the imaging technique, we can see that there's actually nothing below. It's not white paint, it's just actually the paper, and then there's kind of a gray light wash that was used around it to give it kind of some dimension and then indications of stripes. But there's no color or anything like that. Additionally, if you look at the text, we didn't find any sort of edits made to this manuscript map. The text is like very precise. There were no changes or edits or any sort of like underdrawings that we could find throughout the pages. Then we moved on to the pigments. Starting with the red pigment, we identified that as vermilion. It had chemical signatures for mercury and sulfur, and in the reflectance spectra, there was a first derivative peak at 600. So we're very confident that the red is vermilion. The blue we found to be azurite. It contained copper. It had absorptions at 2284 and 2353 nanometers due to hydroxyl and carbonate molecular vibrations. So again, very confident that this was azurite. And then the green we identified as verdigris. It's a green pigment that contains copper and had characteristic reflectance absorption around 710 nanometers. What's interesting about the vermilion is that it's used in two different ways. Verdigris can tend to pull really blue, and so that's how it's used kind of along the coastlines to imply water. And then you can see when it's used in the trees, when we look closer kind of under a microscope, you can see that it's layered with yellow to make it pull a little bit warmer. Unfortunately, we're not able to identify the yellow pigment. It's an organic wash and has pretty much the same spectral signature of paper. So the signal kind of just overloads it, and we can't really separate any specific spectral signatures for it. Not invasively, at least. So again, going back to this supposed Portuguese flag, we were able to see absorptions at 525 and 570 nanometers. And so I'm pretty sure that this is an insect-based red dye. So anthraquinones like cochineal, kermes, and lac, they can't be spectrally distinguished from one another, unfortunately, non-invasively. So we make a best guess based on historic context. So in this way, it's probably cochineal, possibly lac, used as the purple pigment, unique to our map in particular, the library's map. And so, as Juliet said, she was able to look at another hack atlas at the Huntington Library, and we were fortunate enough to be able to get XRF data from them as well to tell us elemental contributions from the pigments there. So from a visual standpoint, we can already see very similar things happening. The red, bright blue, and a green that is layered with yellow. The spectra for the red was very similar to ours, contained mercury. It's most likely vermilion, and as well as with the blue, contains copper, most likely azurite. So we're seeing a couple things here. We're seeing consistent motifs in style, and we're seeing consistent motifs with the raw materials that he's choosing to use across his atlases. So again, in summary, two different watermarks, two types of paper, composition out of iron gall ink, vermilion, azurite, and verdigris, and cochineal. And again, he's being very consistent and very purposeful when he's making this map. It's very consistent pigment-wise throughout all of the maps that are throughout the manuscript, as well as, again, not seeing any sort of underdrawings or edits that have been made. And then before I hand back to Juliet, I just want to say that the collaboration that we're able to do between humanities and science is really paramount to how we can contribute in PRTD to research at the library. And I really appreciate the unique expertise that both researchers and the curators bring to the conversation that allow us to build such a wealth of information about our collections and help us to uncover and explore these items. I think, Julia, are you going to conclude with just a few?
Yeah, very, very cool. It's always like, ooh, with the big reveal with Megan's finds. So as she shared, we found the same two watermarks consistently throughout the East Indies Atlas. What is referred to as the Fleur-de-Lis one and the Strasbourg Bend one. What's interesting is that these are also found in Hack's South Sea Wagoners of the Pacific coast. Not all of them that I know of, but a couple that I've looked at. And so one of these, oops, is that not on here? Okay. Yeah, so these watermarks are also found in the John Carter Brown Library, South Sea Wagoner, the Free Library of Philadelphia, South Sea Wagoner, and also what I think is an English replica of Spanish derrotero. Okay, so you know what? I'm gonna just fast forward. This is all very interesting, but I think just to say that there are consistency in pigments. There are also consistencies in watermarks throughout his projects. And I think what this, suggests is, again, I'm going to just fast forward to, I think this here, to say that this atlas in particular seems like it was a very planned project. And I think all indications, pigments, paper, all of that, point to that. And I will just wrap up by saying that our collaborative study underscores how important it is to work directly with the objects that you are investigating as opposed to working from images of them. But the study also reveals how much more can be learned through, let's scroll through here, through interdisciplinary collaboration between research scientists and art historians or historians. Many of my initial questions based on my visual analysis would remain unanswered without information gained from Megan's scientific study. So in terms of the hydrographer William Hack, our study suggests, this very large scale, almost assembly line type of production emerging from his shop. If it were possible to do this type of analysis at all the institutions where we had Hack atlases, we would have a very precise picture of the working methods and artistic practices of this shadowy Thames School figure. So thank you all very much for your attention.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Juliet Wiersma and Megan Hill. With that, we will open it up for a short question and answer session. So if anyone has any questions you'd like to ask, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll be walking around with a couple microphones. So please ask into the microphone so that we can catch any questions on the recording. So thank you.
You showed us that there were two different watermarks. Have you been able to identify the origin of the paper with those watermarks?
Yes.
Oh, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, thank you. Yes. Um, yes and no. So it England at this point is not making its own paper. It's importing paper, and it seems to largely be importing paper from the Netherlands and from France. And this is more interesting if, like, another study I was working on was looking at Spanish derroteros, or these atlases of sea charts made by Spanish navigators. That paper is completely different. Again, Spain's not making their own paper either, but they're importing it from Italy. And so it's a lot thinner. The watermarks are completely different. And so what this does on the one hand is allow us, we're sort of establishing like a watermark universe for hack. I think there are other atlases that he's made that have a lot of, like, the Bancroft Library. The watermarks are kind of all over the place, and you don't see those in his other atlases. But this Fleur de Lis and the Strasbourg Bend, there's also Strasbourg Bend 2 with 3 stripes that I just was at the Morgan Library in New York looking at another one of his big projects. It's not an atlas, but that and it's got the same watermark, all 263 folios. So in terms of origin, I haven't identified the paper maker specifically, but it's got a new, like, that's the next thing I need to start looking into. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for that question. Does that sort of not doesn't answer? Okay, we get that close. All right.
So with the watermarks, are you able to see a chronology of when different papers were used? And how many different, you mentioned this one at the Morgan Library that has only the same watermark through all the folios. How many different watermarks were found in each of these atlases?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good question too. And I think I've got slides, but it will just take me too long to find the right one. So I mean, I think like what it suggests about something like the Morgan hack, it's like a journal of the pirate Bartholomew Sharp and a few other people. But it just suggests like he sat down and he was going to make this huge thing, right? Like he had been commissioned and he had all the paper and all the supplies. Like that's what it suggests to me. I think when you've got two different watermarks, like we had in the Library of Congress, East Indies Atlas, we were starting to look at like, okay, maybe there's like, are we seeing differences, like stylistic differences, different ways of making the flag, as Megan had pointed out, on these two different watermarks, on pages with two different watermarks. And that made us think, well, like maybe, he's working on these and the other guy's working on the other type of paper. Like we don't exactly know, but it does. I think that the watermarks are they seem to be a way of dating. I started thinking about this a little bit last night when I was kind of looking at all of the data that I'm kind of starting to gather. And it's I can't remember which ones I was looking at. I was looking at so this atlas is circa 1690. That could probably be refined. I can't do it right now, but I was looking at another later atlas that has the same watermark. So that's a question. Like, is it the Fleur de Lis and the Strasbourg Bend 2, are those watermarks that show up in the later works? Like it could be a very useful way to date and maybe seriate. These atlases have been seriated. I don't like maybe based on their covers, like there are various factors that have led to their seriation. But the watermark, I think, angle it would be an interesting one to pay more close to pay more yeah, to pay more attention to. So yeah, thanks.
And I can add to that too, there are databases out there where we can try to look these up. We just haven't had the time yet. This is fairly new research that we've been doing, but that is kind of one of the next steps that we do intend to do.
Thanks so much for your presentation. It was fantastic. I have a very specific materials question. I went to another lecture at the Freer Sackler Conservation, and they were saying that the watercolors on paper, works on paper. So modern watercolors are in gum arabic. Like prior to that, in the Renaissance, it was with glare and some sort of egg white protein. Um, and I think in Asia, it's with isinglass. And so at one point, do like the transitions of materials, when does this happen? And then, like, basically, do you see anything that's happening in these collections? Are there any like Asian watercolor techniques that are being introduced? And do you know why that the watercolors in Asia are like resistant to water? And is it the paper? Is it the size? Is it the medium? Um, I don't have any answers.
No, it's a great question. I am not personally familiar with a lot of Asian works. I haven't had the chance to work on a lot of objects. Um, but I do have colleagues who are very familiar with that, and I'm sure would be happy to answer your question if you wanted to reach out to us to get a more definitive answer. So the techniques that I used, we definitely could figure out what the binders were. Unfortunately, we just ran out of time and couldn't use Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, which would have given us a much more definitive answer as to what the binder was specifically. So it's still something that we can, obviously, we have the collection here, we can go back to it, but we weren't able to figure out what the binder was here. In terms of how binders kind of come about and move around, um, in my knowledge, gum arabic, glare, tempera, those were very common in the West. Rice starch was another one that was more common in Asia. I'm not exactly sure if that ever transitioned to Europe or not. Um, but they also would use like different binders based on kind of what visual effect they wanted to get out of things as well. It also depended on the materiality of the pigments. Some pigments were better bound together in like tempera or egg white. And then again, some like gave it a nice sheen or something like that based on what they were bound with. So I apologize. I don't have a specific answer, but if you want to reach out, I can definitely probably provide you with it.
Outside of the purple and the yellow wash with the verdigris, did you have any challenges with distinguishing some of the pigments that you were seeing, whether it was application, mixture, uh, just anything that was a little bit trickier?
Luckily, with this map, no. Usually the answer is always yes. But again, very straightforward. Like the spectra actually just looked really nice. It was very clearly like mercury and sulfur for vermilion, and then just had like peaks spot on where they should be in the four spectra. And sometimes when you get uh like not very good well-made pigments, you'll get like the peaks will shift, and then you kind of have to play a guessing game of like, is it close enough or is it totally off base and whatever. But no, with this, luckily everything was very straightforward and easy to identify, so very happy about that.